Did you know that one of the greatest movies ever made was almost destroyed before anyone could see it? A powerful man wanted every copy burned to ash. Yet somehow it survived. And today we are going to find out why. Citizen Kane is more than a movie. It is a mystery, a battle, and a miracle all wrapped into one. Dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about Citizen Kane. Number 20. The boy who took over Hollywood. Orson Welles was only 25 years old when he made Citizen Kane. Think about that for a moment. Most people at 25 are still figuring out their lives. They are learning, making mistakes, searching for direction. Welles walked into one of the biggest movie studios in the world and said, "I want complete creative control." And the studio said yes. That almost never happened in Hollywood. Studios had rules, bosses, and committees. Directors followed orders. Actors followed scripts. Everyone answered to someone above them. But Welles had already made a name for himself on radio. In 1938, he narrated a radio version of The War of the Worlds, a story about alien invaders attacking Earth. People across America tuned in and believed it was real. Phones rang. People ran into the streets. Some packed their bags. The chaos was unbelievable. That one radio broadcast made Orson Welles famous overnight. So when RKO Pictures came to him and offered him a deal to make a movie, they were not just hiring a director. They were hiring a sensation. They gave him something almost no director in Hollywood history had ever received: the freedom to write, direct, produce, and even act in his own film. No one could cut his scenes. No one could change his story. He had full creative control from the very first word to the very last frame. It was an extraordinary gift. And Welles used every single inch of that freedom. He pushed boundaries that no one had dared to touch before. He experimented with camera angles, lighting, storytelling, and time. He hired a team of young, hungry artists who were not afraid to try the impossible. What looked like the beginning of a simple movie career was actually the start of a revolution. Young, fearless, and completely free. That was the miracle that made Citizen Kane possible. Number 19. The real man behind the story. Everyone who studies film history knows a secret that the movie never says out loud. Citizen Kane is based on a real person. His name was William Randolph Hearst, and he was one of the most powerful men in America. Hearst owned dozens of newspapers. He had a mansion called San Simeon that sat on a hill in California like a palace from another world. He collected art from around the globe. He threw parties that lasted for days. He had friends in politics, in business, and in Hollywood itself. When Orson Welles created the character of Charles Foster Kane, he took pieces of Hearst's life and turned them into fiction. The enormous castle, the art collection, the newspaper empire, the political ambitions, and even the romantic relationships, all of it echoed Hearst's real story. But Welles added something Hearst had not made public. The character of Susan Alexander in the movie was partly inspired by Marion Davies, the woman Hearst loved. In the film, Kane pushes Susan into an opera career she does not want, even though she has no real talent. Her onto a stage and watches her fail, simply because he refuses to accept the truth. It was a cruel portrait, and it stung. Marion Davies, in real life, was actually a talented actress. Many people who knew her said she was funny, warm, and genuinely gifted. By showing Susan as talentless and humiliated, Welles did something that many considered unfair. But the damage was done. Hearst recognized himself in the film immediately. And he was furious. One powerful man. One devastating portrait. And a battle that would shake all of Hollywood to its number 18. The newspaper king goes to war. When William Randolph Hearst saw what Orson Welles had made, he did not just get angry. He went to war. Hearst had spent decades building one of the most powerful media empires in American history. He owned newspapers from coast to coast, and every single one of them followed his orders. When Hearst decided he did not want Citizen Kane to exist, he picked up the phone and used every weapon he had. His newspapers refused to print any advertisements for the film. They would not publish reviews. They would not even mention the movie's title. For a Hollywood studio trying to sell tickets, this was devastating. At the time, newspaper advertising was everything. Without it, a film could simply disappear into silence. But Hearst did not stop there. He sent reporters digging into the private lives of everyone connected to the movie. He pressured studios. He contacted theater owners and encouraged them not to screen the film, and approached Louis B. Mayer, one of the most powerful producers in Hollywood, and together they tried to buy the film from RKO Pictures, not to release it, but to burn every print that existed. They offered a large sum of money. The studio was tempted. The pressure was enormous. For a terrifying period of time, it looked like Citizen Kane might actually disappear forever. The idea of history's greatest film being destroyed by one angry, powerful man is almost too strange to believe, but it came very close to happening. What saved it in the end was a combination of courage, stubbornness, and a little bit of luck. Power nearly silenced a masterpiece, but art refused to go quiet. Number 17. A camera that changed everything before Citizen Kane. Most Hollywood movies looked a certain way. Characters stood in the middle of the frame. Scenes were brightly lit. Everything was clear and clean and easy to see. Then came Greg Toland, the cinematographer who shot Citizen Kane, and he threw all those rules out the window. Toland invented and perfected a technique called deep focus photography. In deep focus, everything in the frame is sharp at the same time. The person standing close to the camera, the furniture behind them, and the door at the far end of the room. Normally, cameras could only keep one part of the scene in focus at a time, but Toland found ways to use special lenses and precise lighting to keep everything sharp from front to back. This changed the way a scene could tell a story. Directors could show multiple things happening at once without cutting away. In one famous scene, you can see young Kane playing in the snow outside through a window while his parents sign legal papers inside the same frame. The child is blissfully unaware that his whole life is changing. You do not need anyone to explain that moment. The camera shows it all at once, and your heart understands it immediately. Toland was so proud of his work on the film that he insisted on sharing the title card with Welles, something almost unheard of in Hollywood. The two names appeared side by side on screen. It was a gesture of respect and honesty. One camera, one vision, one decision. And movies would never look quite the same again. Number 16. The ceiling that nobody expected. When film crews build a set, they usually do not bother putting a ceiling on. Ceilings are not needed. The cameras point at the actors, not up at the sky. Lighting equipment hangs above, the microphones dangle from booms, and the crew moves freely above the set. There is no ceiling because there does not need to be one. But Orson Welles wanted his camera to look upward. He wanted low angles, dramatic shots where the camera was almost on the floor and the characters towered above it like giants. Shots made Kane look powerful, threatening, and larger than life. But there was a problem. Camera upward, you see the top of the set. The top of the set is just open space and equipment. You had to build real ceilings for every single room in Citizen Kane. Never been done in a Hollywood film before. The ceilings were made of fabric stretched over frames, which solved the problem of showing them on camera. They also trapped the heat from the lights inside the set. Temperatures rose. The crew sweated through long days of filming. The fabric ceilings soaked in the heat and turned the sets into ovens. Every actor who walked onto those sets felt the weight of that decision. When you watch the movie, those low-angle shots with real ceilings above create a feeling of claustrophobia, of power, of a world pressing down on you. It looked like a simple creative choice, cost the entire crew their comfort. It gave the film one of its most unforgettable visual signatures. Number 15. A word that started a mystery. Rosebud. It is the most famous last word in movie history. Charles Foster Kane, dying alone in his enormous castle, drops a snow globe and whispers that single word before he breathes his last breath. The entire film is a detective story built around that word. A reporter interviews everyone who knew Kane, trying to discover what Rosebud meant to him. Enemies, wives, and colleagues are all asked the same question. Nobody knows. And at the very end of the movie, the camera drifts through a warehouse full of Kane's possessions, art, furniture, crates, and boxes, till it finds a small wooden sled being tossed into a furnace. Burns, the camera catches the word painted on its side. Rosebud. It was the sled from his childhood. One thing he truly loved before money and power swept his life away. The mystery is solved, but the sadness of that answer stays with you for a long time. And here is the strange part. Orson Welles himself admitted in later years that he thought Rosebud was a little too simple, too neat. He said real life rarely tied itself into such clean bows. He even called the device a gimmick. But audiences and critics did not agree. A single word became one of the most analyzed, discussed, and celebrated moments in cinema. A man's whisper, a burning sled, and a question that echoed through movie history for decades. Sometimes the simplest things carry the heaviest meaning. Number 14. The actor who had never made a movie. When Orson Welles arrived in Hollywood to make Citizen Kane, he brought almost his entire theater company with him. These were actors from the Mercury Theater, a stage company Welles had founded in New York. They were brilliant performers, trained, disciplined, and fearless on stage. Almost none of them had ever worked in front of a movie camera before. Joseph Cotten, who became one of Hollywood's great stars, had never made a film. Agnes Moorehead, who played Kane's cold and distant mother, had no film experience. Everett Sloan, Ruth Warrick went on. Entire cast of stage veterans walking onto a film set for the very first time, making one of the most technically ambitious movies ever attempted. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, but Welles turned it into an advantage because these actors did not know what they were supposed to do in front of a camera, did not do the things that most movie actors always did. They did not find their light in the expected way. They did not hit their marks mechanically, moved naturally, with the freedom of people who had spent years trusting their instincts on stage. Results were performances that felt alive in a way that many films of that era simply did not. Camera caught something raw and unpolished and absolutely real. Welles called it beginner's luck. Critics called it genius. The truth was somewhere in between. Sometimes not knowing the rules is the greatest freedom of all. Number 13. The story of a man. Getting old, one of the most astonishing challenges in making Citizen Kane was that the film had to show Charles Foster Kane aging from a young man in his 20s all the way to an old man in his 70s. Actor Orson Welles had to play all of those ages. And Welles himself was only 25 when they filmed it. The makeup department faced an almost impossible task. They had to age a young man's face by 50 years using the tools and materials available in 1940. There were no digital effects, no computer-generated wrinkles, and no digital replacement. Everything had to be done by hand, with foam rubber, paint, latex, and extraordinary skill. The makeup artist Maurice Siderman spent weeks designing the aging process for Kane. He built custom prosthetics, crafted padded suits to suggest a heavier body, and created a step-by-step transformation plan that moved through decades of Kane's life. Total work involved hundreds of hours of preparation. Each day of filming, the older Kane required hours in the makeup chair before a single camera rolled. When the final product appeared on screen, audiences were stunned. The young man who started the film and the broken old man who ended it did not look like the same person, but they were. Welles carried the entire emotional journey of a life inside one performance. What looked like a natural transformation across decades was actually one of the most labor-intensive makeup jobs in Hollywood history. Years were fake. The sadness was real. Number 12. The scene that broke the rules of time. Hollywood movies in the 1940s followed a clear, simple rule about time. Stories moved forward. You started at the beginning and ended at the end. Audiences expected that. It felt natural, like reading a book from the first page to the last. Citizen Kane broke that rule completely. The film opens with Kane's death. In the very first minutes, the man is already gone. Everything that follows is memory, flashbacks, interviews, fragments of a life told out of order by people who each knew only a piece of the truth. The structure of the film is like a broken mirror. Each person who speaks about Kane shows you a different reflection of the same man. One remembers a generous friend, another remembers a tyrant, third remembers a dreamer who lost his way. None of the reflections match perfectly, and the audience has to hold all of these pieces together and decide for themselves who Charles Foster Kane really was. This kind of nonlinear storytelling was almost unheard of in mainstream cinema at the time. Today, films regularly jump through time, cut between past and present, and trust audiences to follow along. We take it for granted. In 1941, Orson Welles was asking audiences to do something genuinely new and genuinely difficult. Critics called it confusing, Others called it a revolution. The technique has influenced almost every ambitious filmmaker who came after. What looked like a structural experiment was actually a new language for telling human stories. Number 11. The breakfast table scene. There is a sequence in Citizen Kane that lasts only a few minutes on screen, but it contains an entire marriage inside it. It is called the breakfast montage. Welles shows Kane and his first wife Emily sitting across from each other at the breakfast table, but he shows it multiple times, in quick cuts, jumping years forward with each scene. In the beginning, they are in love. They lean toward each other. They smile. The light is warm. Then, slowly, with each cut forward in time, they move a little further apart. The conversation grows shorter. The expressions grow colder. By the end of the montage, they sit at opposite ends of a long table, reading rival newspapers in silence. No shouting. No dramatic fights. No single terrible moment that broke them apart. Just distance. Just the slow, quiet erosion of something that once felt like everything. The breakfast montage is studied in film schools around the world because it does something very difficult with extraordinary economy. It shows the death of a relationship in 3 minutes without a single line of dramatic dialogue. It trusts the audience to feel the sadness without being told to feel. Welles himself said that he wanted to show how two people can drift apart without either of them noticing it happening. That truth is so human, so universal, so achingly familiar that it still hurts to watch. What looked like a simple series of meals was actually a complete love story, ending in silence. Number 10. The voice that carried the film. Orson Welles had one of the most remarkable voices in the history of American performance. Deep, warm, commanding, flexible. His voice could fill a room with power and then drop to a whisper that made you lean in to hear every word. When you watch Citizen Kane, the voice is inseparable from the character. Kane's voice changes as he ages. In his youth, it has energy and ambition and the brightness of someone who believes the world is waiting for him. In his old age, it carries fatigue and bitterness and the hollow echo of a man who has everything except the one thing he lost long ago. He understood that voice was not decoration. This was character. It was soul made into sound. He trained his Mercury Theater actors in vocal technique just as seriously as he trained them in physical movement. He believed that an audience should be able to close their eyes and understand exactly what a character was feeling just from the sound of their voice. During production, Welles sometimes recorded audio separately and then matched the visuals to it afterward, a technique more common in theater than in film. He was not willing to let the technical demands of the camera limit what his voice could do. What audiences heard when they watched Citizen Kane was not just a man speaking lines. Orson Welles using every tool his voice had ever developed to make one fictional man feel more real than most people they had ever met. The camera told you what to see. The voice told you what to feel. Number 9. A film that almost never got released. When Citizen Kane was finished, RKO Pictures sat on it. William Randolph Hearst's campaign against the film had worked well enough to make the studio nervous about releasing it at all. Theater chains were hesitant. Advertisers were worried. The people who ran Hollywood's distribution networks had heard Hearst's warnings, and many of them wanted no trouble. For months, the finished film sat in a vault while executives debated whether to show it to the public at all. There were real conversations about burying it permanently. Imagine that. That would later be voted the greatest American film ever made, sitting unseen in a can, while frightened men in suits argued about whether it was too dangerous to show. It was RKO executive George Schaefer who finally insisted on releasing the film. Schaefer had personally championed Welles and given him his extraordinary contract. He had believed in the project from the beginning, and he refused to let fear win. He pushed the film into release in May of 1941. In New York was attended by critics and press, and the reviews were among the most enthusiastic ever written for an American film. The performance was disappointing. Hearst's blackout of advertising kept many ordinary moviegoers from ever hearing about the film. It did not make back its budget on its initial run. For years, it was considered a commercial failure despite its critical praise. It took decades for the full truth to emerge. Sometimes greatness needs time to find its audience, and sometimes one brave decision is all that stands between a masterpiece and oblivion. Number 8. The lightning strike. Editing. One of the most overlooked revolutions in Citizen Kane happened not in front of the camera, but in the editing room. The editor on the film was Robert Wise. Yes, the same Robert Wise who would later direct West Side Story and The Sound of Music. In 1941, Wise was a young, talented editor working alongside Welles to cut the film together. They broke every conventional rule of Hollywood editing. This happened at unexpected moments. Scenes ended before audiences expected them to. Some transitions were jarring, abrupt, almost violent in their timing. Welles treated editing like another form of storytelling. He did not use cuts simply to move from one scene to the next. He used them to make the audience feel the passage of time, the emotional weight of a moment, the irony of a contrast. Every cut in Citizen Kane has a reason. Every transition carries meaning. What felt like instinct was actually architecture. What looked like chaos had a precise and beautiful logic underneath it all. Number 7. The opera disaster that was real. One of the most painful storylines in Citizen Kane involves Susan Alexander, Kane's second wife, whom he forces to sing in an opera despite her obvious lack of talent. Welles wanted the opera scenes to feel genuinely excruciating, the kind of performance where everyone in the audience is suffering but too polite or too afraid to say so. To achieve this, Welles hired a real opera singer to perform Susan's singing scene, but he made a fascinating creative decision. He instructed the singer to deliberately sing just slightly wrong, not terribly, not so badly that it became a joke, but just off enough that trained ears would notice and wince. The goal was a specific kind of second-rate quality, good enough to understand what the song was meant to be, but just bad enough to feel the gap between ambition and reality. The sets for the opera scenes were enormous and elaborate. Shot them from extremely high angles to emphasize Susan's smallness on that massive stage. The camera up in the rigging, looking down at her tiny, trembling figure below. The audience she sang for became a sea of barely tolerant faces. The whole sequence was designed to create a feeling of embarrassed compassion. You feel sorry for Susan and furious at Kane simultaneously. No digital trickery made those opera sets feel oppressive. No visual effect made Susan look small and alone. It was lighting, architecture, camera placement, and a deliberately flawed performance. Real craft creating a feeling of beautiful, painful failure. Number 6. Xanadu. Was built in miniature, Kane's castle, the enormous Gothic isolated fortress called Xanadu, is one of the most iconic images in all of cinema. It's on a hill in Florida, surrounded by fog and shadow, a monument to one man's ego and loneliness. It is vast. It is cold. It feels ancient and modern at the same time, impossibly grand and deeply empty. And it was never built, not even close to full size. Xanadu that appears in the film was a miniature, a very large and very detailed miniature built by the special effects team to extraordinary precision, but a miniature nonetheless. The crew built a scale model of the castle that was probably around 4 feet tall. They lit it carefully, surrounded it with atmospheric fog, and filmed it in ways designed to make it look absolutely enormous. Techniques used were so effective that many people who watched the film in 1941 never questioned for a moment that Xanadu was a real place. The illusion was perfect. The lighting played on the model's stone-like surfaces to create shadows that suggested age and weight. Fog softened the edges and made the castle seem to float above the earth like something from a dream. The model was later stored after production, and its current whereabouts are unknown. It may have been destroyed. It may have been lost somewhere in a warehouse. The greatest castle in movie history was the size of a bookshelf. Felt like a real monument was a beautiful lot crafted by patient hands. Number 5. The sled was not the original ending. Here is a secret that many fans of Citizen Kane do not know. The ending that audiences saw, the burning sled, the revelation of Rosebud, was not Orson Welles' original intention for how the film should close. In early drafts of the script, written by Welles and his co-writer Herman J. Mankiewicz, the resolution of the Rosebud mystery was handled quite differently. The meaning was less clear, more ambiguous, reportedly not entirely comfortable with spelling out the answer so directly. That leaving the mystery partially unsolved was truer to real life. People die with their secrets. The people who loved them are left without answers. That is the honest version of grief. But the practical demands of storytelling and the input of collaborators during the writing process pushed the script toward a cleaner resolution. The snow globe, the sled, the warehouse fire, all of these elements were refined and clarified through draft after draft until the final version locked the meaning in place. Welles went along with it. He made it work beautifully. In interviews, he returned to the subject more than once, suggesting that Rosebud might have been a mistake. Too simple, too neat for a story about a man as complicated as Kane. What audiences received was a masterpiece with a satisfying ending. What Welles may have wanted was something more unsettling, and sometimes the artist and the audience want different things, and sometimes the audience wins. Number 4. The standing ovation that became a scandal. Citizen Kane was released. It was submitted for consideration for the Academy Awards. The film received 9 nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor for Orson Welles. At the time, this was considered a remarkable achievement for a debut film from a first-time director. But what happened at the ceremony itself was something nobody had planned. When the nominations for Citizen Kane were announced and the film's name was spoken aloud at the event, a section of the audience booed. Not politely, not softly. They booed loudly and openly. The men and women in that room who worked for William Randolph Hearst, or feared him, or owed him favors, they made their feelings known in the most public way possible. It was an extraordinary display of the power that Hearst still commanded over Hollywood. The booing was an act of intimidation, a message sent to the entire industry that supporting Welles meant choosing a side. In the end, Citizen Kane won only 1 Oscar, for Best Original Screenplay, shared between Orson Welles and Herman J. Mankiewicz. It lost Best Picture to How Green Was My Valley. Many film historians have argued in the decades since that the loss was politically motivated, a result of the pressure Hearst had applied throughout the industry. It remains one of the most discussed Oscar results in history. What should have been a celebration became a battle, and the battle left scars on Orson Welles that never fully healed. Number 3. Mankiewicz and the Fight Over Credit. Screenplay for Citizen Kane is one of the most celebrated scripts in movie history. It was listed by the Writers Guild of America as the greatest screenplay ever written, and it was the center of a bitter and painful controversy that began the moment the film was finished and has never entirely been resolved. Welles and Herman J. Mankiewicz were both credited as co-writers, but for decades, Welles claimed that the work was essentially his, that Mankiewicz had contributed ideas, but that the final structure, the final language, and the final vision were Welles' own. Then, in 1971, film critic Pauline Kael published a long and detailed essay arguing the opposite. She claimed that Mankiewicz had written the essential draft of the script and that Welles had taken far too much credit. The argument caught fire. Scholars, filmmakers, and critics chose sides. The debate became one of the most heated in film studies. Later researchers went through the original drafts, the memos, the letters, and the testimony of people who were there. The emerging consensus suggested that the truth was genuinely complicated. Mankiewicz wrote the earliest drafts, including the basic structure and the idea of Rosebud. But Welles rewrote extensively, shaped the film's voice, and brought his theatrical imagination to nearly every scene. Both men contributed enormously. Both men deserved credit. But egos and ambitions and the hunger for legacy made sharing difficult. 2 brilliant men, one extraordinary script, and a fight for history that neither of them could fully win. Number 2. The film that was forgotten and rediscovered. After its initial release in 1941, Citizen Kane disappeared from public view for many years. The film did not have a successful theatrical run. Hearst's campaign had limited its advertising reach, and audiences who might have loved it simply never heard of it. After its first release, the prints were locked away. RKO eventually sold its film library, and Citizen Kane was packaged with dozens of other titles and largely forgotten. For years, it was not screened in theaters. It was not available for study. Film students and scholars who had heard about this remarkable film had very limited access to actually watch it. Then, slowly, something changed. Film societies began to seek it out. Critics who had seen it on its original release wrote about it from memory with a reverence that made younger cinephiles desperately curious. Television came along in the 1950s. The film finally found a wide audience for the first time. People watching late at night on their small screens discovered something extraordinary, a film that felt as bold and strange and alive as if it had been made yesterday. The critical reassessment accelerated through the 1960s and 1970s. By 1998, Citizen Kane sat at the very top of the American Film Institute's list of the greatest American movies ever made. A film that was nearly destroyed, nearly lost, and largely unseen for years had climbed to the summit of cinema history. Forgotten by the world, then remembered by everyone. It is one of the most extraordinary second acts in the story of any art. Number 1. The Man Who Made It and Lost Everything. If you want to understand why Citizen Kane is so powerful, you have to understand what happened to Orson Welles after he made it. He was 25 when the film was released. He was supposed to become the king of Hollywood. He had talent, vision, courage, and a contract that gave him more freedom than any director before him. Instead, the film's commercial failure and the political damage caused by the Hearst campaign destroyed his relationship with RKO. His next film, The Magnificent Ambersons, was taken away from him while he was out of the country. The studio cut over 50 minutes from his version and released a shorter, flatter film without his approval. The original cut no longer exists. It was apparently destroyed. Welles never fully recovered from that blow. He spent the rest of his career working on projects that were underfunded, interrupted, and often left unfinished. He directed masterpieces, Touch of Evil, Othello, Chimes at Midnight, but he never again had the freedom or the resources that RKO had given him at 25. He spent decades raising money from independent sources, filming scenes when he could afford to, and assembling movies in fragments across years. The man who had everything at 25 spent the rest of his life chasing what he had lost. He died in 1985. On the morning of his death, he was working on a new script. He never stopped. He never gave up. He never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, he would make another film that touched the absolute truth of human experience. The boy who took over Hollywood became the man who taught it everything. And in return, Hollywood never quite gave him what he deserved. What looked like the beginning of a golden career was actually a single, blazing, irreplaceable peak. And the film that stood at the top of that peak still stands there today, burning bright, refusing to be forgotten. Bonus fact: the sound that nobody noticed. There is a moment in Citizen Kane that almost no one notices the first time they watch it. It requires you to close your eyes and just listen. Throughout the film, Orson Welles and his sound designer worked to create an audio world that was as carefully constructed as anything you could see on screen. Hollywood films of that era, sound was functional. Dialogue was clear. Music scored the emotions. Sound effects named the objects on screen. But Welles wanted sound to do something more. He wanted it to carry feeling, the way that music does, even when there was no music playing. In the Great Hall of Xanadu, when Kane and Susan speak to each other across its enormous empty space, Welles instructed the sound engineers to record their voices with a specific echo, long, cold, slightly hollow, that made the room feel less like a home and more like a prison. The architecture of the sound told you that these two people were not close, even when they were standing in the same room. The echo was the loneliness. When Kane is young and passionate and surrounded by people who love him, the sound in those scenes is warm and close and intimate. The voices feel like they are coming from just beside you. But as Kane grows older and loses everything that matters, the sound environment changes around him. Spaces get bigger, voices get smaller. The world itself seems to pull back from him. The technique was so subtle that most audiences absorbed it without ever understanding why the movie felt the way it did. They just knew it felt lonely. They just knew it felt cold. They felt a man's life growing emptier without being told. Welles called it using every instrument in the orchestra, not just the ones you could see, the ones you could only feel. One quiet, invisible decision, repeated through every scene. And it changed the emotional weather of an entire film. Old tools, new magic? Citizen Kane is more than a movie about a rich man who dies alone. It is a story about what happens when a person mistakes power for love and money for meaning. It is a story about childhood, about the small, simple things that make us who we are, and how easy it is to lose them without noticing they are gone. Orson Welles was 25 years old and burning with ideas that would take the rest of the world decades to fully understand. He made something that was ahead of its time, fought for by almost no one, nearly destroyed, and ultimately impossible to kill. The facts behind this film are as strange and dramatic as the story it tells. A young genius, a powerful enemy, a burning sled, a whispered word. Choices made in dark rooms that changed the way movies were made forever. Every single frame of Citizen Kane is an argument that art matters. That even when powerful people try to silence it, art finds a way to survive. That the things we make with our full hearts and our wildest imagination have a life of their own, a life that can outlast the people who made them, and even the people who tried to destroy them. That is the real story behind Rosebud, not just a sled, a reminder that the truest things about us are often the smallest, the quietest, and the first things we lose. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.